Section 2 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Hannah Dormer. Section 2. This late age of the world's experience had bred in them all men and women, a well of tears. Tears and sorrows, courage and endurance, a perfectly upright and stoical bearing. Think, for example, of the woman she admired most, Lady Bexborough, opening the bazaar. There were Jorrocks' Jaunts and Jollities, there were Soapy Sponge and Mrs. Asquith's memoirs, and big game shooting in Nigeria, all spread open. Ever so many books there were, but none that seemed exactly right to take to Evelyn Whitbread in her nursing home. Nothing that would serve to amuse her and make that indescribably dried-up little woman look, as Clarissa came in, just for a moment cordial, before they settled down for the usual interminable talk of women's ailments. How much she wanted it. That people should look pleased as she came in, Clarissa thought, and turned and walked back towards Bond Street, annoyed, because it was silly to have other reasons for doing things. Much rather would she have been one of those people like Richard who did things for themselves. Whereas, she thought, waiting to cross, half the time she did things not simply, not for themselves, but to make people think this or that. Perfect idiocy, she knew. And now the policeman held up his hand. For no one was ever for a second taken in. Oh, if she could have had her life over again, she thought, stepping onto the pavement, could have looked even differently. She would have been, in the first place, dark like Lady Bexborough, with a skin of crumpled leather and beautiful eyes. She would have been, like Lady Bexborough, slow and stately, rather large, interested in politics like a man, with a country house, very dignified, very sincere. Instead of which she had a narrow pea-stick figure, a ridiculous little face, beaked like a bird's. That she held herself well was true, and had nice hands and feet, and dressed well, considering that she spent little. But often now this body she wore, she stopped to look at a Dutch picture. This body, with all its capacities, seemed nothing, nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. There being no more marrying, no more having of children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them, up Bond Street. This being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa any more. This being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street early in the morning in the season, its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years, a few pearls, salmon on an ice block. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers. That is all, she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves. And her old Uncle William used to say, a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, I have had enough. Gloves and shoes. She had a passion for gloves, but her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. Not a straw, she thought, going on up Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers for her when she gave a party. Elizabeth really cared for her dog most of all. The whole house this morning smelt of tar. Still, better poor Grizzle than Miss Kilman. Better distemper and tar and all the rest of it than sitting mewed in a stuffy bedroom with a prayer book. Better anything, she was inclined to say. But it might be only a phase, as Richard said, such as all girls go through. It might be falling in love. But why with Miss Kilman? Who had been badly treated, of course, one must make allowances for that. And Richard said she was very able, had a really historical mind. Anyhow, they were inseparable, and Elizabeth, her own daughter, went to communion, and how she dressed, how she treated people who came to lunch, she did not care a bit, it being her experience that the religious ecstasy made people callous, so did causes. Dulled their feelings, for Miss Kilman would do anything for the Russians, starved herself for the Austrians, but in private inflicted positive torture, so insensitive was she, dressed in a green mackintosh coat. Year in, year out, she wore that coat. She perspired. She was never in the room 5 minutes without making you feel her superiority, your inferiority. How poor she was, how rich you were, how she lived in a slum without a cushion or a bed or a rug or whatever it might be. All her soul rusted with that grievance sticking in it. Her dismissal from school during the war. Poor, embittered, unfortunate creature. For it was not her one hated, but the idea of her, which undoubtedly had gathered into itself a great deal that was not Miss Kilman, had become one of those spectres with which one battles in the night. One of those spectres who stand astride us and suck up half our lifeblood, dominators and tyrants. For no doubt with another throw of the dice, had the black been uppermost and not the white, she would have loved Miss Kilman. But not in this world, no. It rasped her, though, to have stirring about in her this brutal monster, to hear twigs cracking and feel hooves planted down in the depths of that leaf-encumbered forest, the soul, never to be content quite or quite secure, for at any moment the brute would be stirring, this hatred, which especially since her illness had power to make her feel scraped, hurt in her spine, gave her physical pain, and made all pleasure in beauty, in friendship, in being well, in being loved, and making her home delightful rock, quiver and bend, as if indeed there were a monster grubbing at the roots, as if the whole panoply of content were nothing but self-love. This hatred! Nonsense, nonsense, she cried to herself, pushing through the swing doors of Mulberry's the florist's. She advanced, light, tall, very upright, to be greeted at once by button-faced Miss Pym, whose hands were always bright red, as if they had been stood in cold water with the flowers. There were flowers. Delphiniums, sweet peas, bunches of lilac, and carnations, masses of carnations. There were roses, there were irises. Ah, yes. So she breathed in the earthy garden sweet smell as she stood talking to Miss Pym, who owed her help, and thought her kind, for kind she had been years ago, very kind. But she looked older this year, turning her head from side to side among the irises and roses and nodding tufts of lilac with her eyes half closed, snuffing in, after the street uproar, the delicious scent, the exquisite coolness. And then, opening her eyes, how fresh, like frilled linen clean from a laundry, laid in wicker trays, the roses looked, and dark and prim the red carnations holding their heads up, and all the sweet peas spreading in their bowls, tinged violet, snow-white, pale, as if it were the evening and girls in muslin frocks came out to pick sweet peas and roses after the superb summer's day, with its almost blue-black sky, its delphiniums, its carnations, its arum lilies, was over, and it was the moment between 6 and 7 when every flower, roses, carnations, irises, lilac, glows. White, violet, red, deep orange, every flower seems to burn by itself, softly, purely in the misty beds. And how she loved the grey-white moths spinning in and out, over the cherry pie, over the evening primroses. And as she begun to go with Miss Pym from jar to jar, choosing, nonsense, nonsense, she said to herself, more and more gently, as if this beauty, this scent, this colour, and Miss Pym liking her, trusting her, were a wave which she let flow over her and surmount that hatred, that monster, surmount it all. And it lifted her up and up when, oh, a pistol shot in the street outside. "Dear, those motor cars," said Miss Pym, going to the window to look, and coming back and smiling apologetically with her hands full of sweet peas, as if those motor cars, those tires of motor cars, were all her fault. The violent explosion which made Mrs. Dalloway jump and Miss Pym go to the window and apologize came from a motor car which had drawn to the side of the pavement precisely opposite Mulberry's shop window. Passers-by, who, of course, stopped and stared, had just time to see a face of the very greatest importance against the dove-grey upholstery before a male hand drew the blind and there was nothing to be seen except a square of dove-grey. Yet rumours were at once in circulation from the middle of Bond Street to Oxford Street on one side, to Atkinson's scent shop on the other, passing invisibly, inaudibly, like a cloud, swift, veil-like upon hills, falling indeed with something of a cloud's sudden sobriety and stillness upon faces which a second before had been utterly disorderly. But now mystery had brushed them with her wing. They had heard the voice of authority. The spirit of religion was abroad with her eyes bandaged tight and her lips gaping wide. But nobody knew whose face had been seen. Was it the Prince of Wales's? The Queen's? The Prime Minister's? Whose face was it? Nobody knew. Edgar J. Watkiss, with his roll of lead piping round his arm, said audibly, humorously of course, "The Prime Minister's cure." Septimus Warren Smith, who found himself unable to pass, heard him. Septimus Warren Smith, aged about 30, pale-faced, beak-nosed, wearing brown shoes and a shabby overcoat, with hazel eyes which had that look of apprehension in them which makes complete strangers apprehensive too. The world has raised its whip. Where will it descend? Everything had come to a standstill. The throb of the motor engine sounded like a pulse, irregularly drumming through an entire body. The sun became extraordinarily hot because the motor car had stopped outside Mulberry's shop window. Old ladies on the tops of omnibuses spread their black parasols. Here a green, here a red parasol opened with a little pop. Mrs. Dalloway, coming to the window with her arms full of sweet peas, looked out with her little pink face pursed in inquiry. Everyone looked at the motor car. Septimus looked. Boys on bicycles sprang off. Traffic accumulated. And there the motor car stood, with drawn blinds, and upon them a curious pattern, like a tree, Septimus thought, and this gradual drawing together of everything to one centre before his eyes, as if some horror had come almost to the surface and was about to burst into flames, terrified him. The world wavered and quivered and threatened to burst into flames. It is I who am blocking the way, he thought. Was he not being looked at and pointed at? Was he not weighted there, rooted to the pavement for a purpose? But for what purpose? "Let us go on, Septimus," said his wife, a little woman with large eyes and a sallow-pointed face, an Italian girl. But Lucretia herself could not help looking at the motor car and the tree pattern on the blinds. Was it the Queen in there? The Queen going shopping? The chauffeur, who had been opening something, turning something, shutting something, got onto the box. "Come on," said Lucretia. But her husband, for they had been married 4 or 5 years now, jumped, started, and said, "All right!" angrily, as if she had interrupted him. People must notice. People must see. People, she thought, looking at the crowd, standing at the motor car. The English people, with their children and their horses and their clothes, which she admired in a way, but they were people now, because Septimus had said, "I will kill myself." An awful thing to say. Suppose they had heard him? She looked at the crowd. Help! Help! She wanted to cry out to the butchers' boys and women. Help! Only last autumn she and Septimus had stood on the embankment wrapped in the same cloak, and Septimus reading a paper instead of talking. She had snatched it from him and laughed in the old man's face who saw them. But failure one conceals. She must take him away into some park. "Now we will cross," she said. She had a right to his arm, though it was without feeling. He would give her, who was so simple, so impulsive, only 24, without friends in England, who had left Italy for his sake, a piece of bone. End of Section 2, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 20th of March, 2021.